You wake up cold. Again. Because it's 11:47 and central heating is still about 800 years away. Your mattress is straw, your blanket is guilt, and your dreams, if they even managed to survive the frost, smelled like mildew and parchment. You're not a knight, not a lord, not even a humble peasant with dirt under his nails and a goat to call friend. No, you're worse. You're literate. And in this world, that means one thing. You've been sentenced to a life of ink, silence, and copying the same 3 sentences from Augustine's Confessions until your fingers go numb and your soul files for early retirement. Before we dive into that joyful abyss, maybe set the mood. Turn off the lights. Light a candle, or at least pretend to. A fan helps too. That soft hum makes this feel less like a medieval prison and more like a late-night confessional. And hey, if this kind of strange storytelling makes your insomniac heart beat a little slower, consider subscribing. Only if you want to, of course. No vows required. Let me know in the comments what time it is where you are. It's always a strange comfort to know someone else out there is wandering the monastery of YouTube at 3 a.m. Now back to your life. Your robe, which smells like damp wool and unsanctified stress, clings to your body like spiritual disappointment. The bell rings, a sound so ancient and hollow it feels less like a call to prayer and more like God tapping his foot. You eat breakfast in silence, surrounded by 30 other men who look like they've been awake since the invention of Latin. The bread is hard. The soup is colder than your hopes. But you chew, because salvation waits for no one, and neither does Brother Malachi, who's already judging your table manners. The scriptorium is a place where ambition goes to die. A long wooden hall with windows that don't open, candles that don't cooperate, and desks designed by someone who clearly hated the concept of lumbar support. You sit, you exhale, you dip your quill in ink, and then you begin. Again. Line after line, your eyes scan the faded letters of an older manuscript, and your hand, like some possessed creature of duty, copies each stroke with monkish precision. One wrong flick, one lazy loop, and your abbot will ask if the Holy Spirit guided that spelling error, or if it was just Satan in your wrist. Hours pass, or maybe years. It's hard to tell. Time is a luxury you gave up around the same time you took your vows and agreed to be buried alive in vellum. Your fingers cramp. Your back aches. Your ink runs dry at the worst possible moment, right in the middle of eternal life. You sigh. Refill. Keep going. Because books don't copy themselves, and salvation, apparently, is available only through arthritis. Outside, the wind howls. Birds fly freely, mocking you with their literacy-free lifestyle. Somewhere, a peasant sings off-key while stomping grapes for wine you'll never taste. And you, stuck between the Gospels and Gregory the Great, wonder if anyone, centuries from now, will even care that you once rewrote the rule of Saint Benedict by hand. Spoiler, they won't. At best, a modern tourist will glance at your script behind glass and say cool font. Still, you continue. Because this is what you do. Not for fame. Not for glory. Not even for divine reward. You do it because someone has to. Because somewhere in that endless sea of ink, there's a strange kind of peace. A rhythm. A quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't demand anything from you except patience. And maybe a stronger wrist. And when the bell rings again, signaling prayer or food or some indistinguishable form of suffering, you look down at your work. Flawless. Almost holy. And for one brief, flickering moment, you feel it. Not joy, not pride, but the distant hum of permanence. The idea that maybe, just maybe, your invisible hands helped hold the world together. One painstaking letter at a time. Lunch arrives sometime after your soul leaves your body. It's unclear whether the meal is meant to nourish you or simply remind you that joy is a sin. You eat in silence, of course, because chewing while making conversation is for heathens and Italians. On the plate? Stew, or something stew-adjacent. Mostly water with ambition. A carrot floats by like a lost pilgrim. You catch it. Victory. After the meal, there's an hour for meditative reflection, which roughly translates to stare at a wall and wonder how your life became an endless loop of ink, parchment, and low blood sugar. You think, briefly, about rebellion, about saying something, anything, but the last monk who tried that now illuminates the margins of the Rule of Saint Benedict as a cautionary tale with gold leaf eyebrows. So instead, you stretch your spine like a broken hinge, crack your knuckles like a heretic at trial, and return to the scriptorium. Again, because copying ancient texts by hand isn't just your job, it's your entire identity. There's no retirement plan, no career growth. The only promotion here is death, and even that comes with paperwork. Our desk tilts forward just enough to discourage comfort and ambition. You wonder if it's ergonomic design, or a moral lesson carved into furniture. You pray to Saint Isidore, patron of scribes and nervous breakdowns. The stain fades. Salvation resumes. Outside, the world goes on without you. Merchants shout. Children laugh. A sheep sneezes. Meanwhile, you're here debating whether the Latin "you" should curl slightly more toward the left because Brother Adhelm said something passive-aggressive about your last uncials. You fantasize, just briefly, about writing a completely fake gospel. One where Jesus invents breakfast and tells Peter to chill. But you don't, because heresy is frowned upon. And also because you'd have to illuminate it. And that's a lot of gold leaf to waste on sarcasm. And then comes the worst moment of the day, illumination duty. Gold, red, blue, green. Colors you barely see because the room is lit by one candle and your slowly fading hope. You paint a dragon into the margin of a sermon about humility. No one will notice. Or maybe they will. Maybe 1,000 years from now, some scholar will say, "Ah yes, the monk clearly meant this as a symbolic commentary on temptation." No, you were just bored. The bell rings for Vespers. You rise, stiff as an overbaked communion wafer. You shuffle into the chapel, your body creaking like poorly-bound scripture. You chant the Psalms in a low, echoing drone that sounds less like praise and more like an exhausted bee in a stone jar. Your voice blends with the others until you disappear. Again. Later, back in your cell, you lie awake staring at the ceiling, which is made of gilt and cobwebs. You think of the scrolls you've copied, the ones you'll never read, the ideas you've preserved but don't dare question. And still, you feel it, that faint pulse of something ancient and impossible. Maybe it's faith. Maybe it's Stockholm Syndrome in a robe. Either way, you close your eyes and whisper one final prayer, not to God, but to your ink bottle. Please don't dry out tomorrow, because tomorrow will greet you with cold breath and no apology. And the word must go on. Sleep doesn't come easy when your pillow is stuffed with straw and existential dread. You try counting sheep, but even they seem disappointed in your life choices. At some point, your eyelids surrender, not from peace, but from sheer muscle fatigue, and you drift off into a dream where you're free, barefoot in a meadow, reciting Cicero to a goose. Then the bell rings. Again, because nothing gold can stay, especially not in a monastery, where gold is for illuminating letters, not improving quality of life. Morning hits like divine punishment with a side of frostbite. Your joints crack like poorly fired clay. You wash your face with water so cold it qualifies as a minor baptism. Another day, another manuscript. Another chance to transcribe the same sentence 50 times without stabbing yourself with a quill. Progress. You shuffle to the scriptorium like a man on his way to be canonized or executed. It's hard to tell which. You pass Brother Thomas, who hasn't blinked since Advent. You nod. He does not nod back. Emotion is inefficient here. You sit down. Your stool groans under the weight of regret and 3 decades of poor posture. Your fingers already smell like iron gall ink. Your soul smells like ink, too. Today's task: copying a treatise on the moral dangers of laughter. Irony is not dead. It's just copying itself in Latin. You begin. Risus abundat in or stultorum. Laughter abounds in the mouth of fools. You chuckle. Quietly, furtively, sinfully. And then you immediately feel bad. Because that's the whole point. As the hours drag on, your hand begins to betray you. Letters lean awkwardly. Margins tremble. Your S starts looking more like a snake that's questioning its life choices. You remember the legend of the monk who once sneezed during illumination and turned the Virgin Mary into something that looked suspiciously like a duck. They say he was sent to the beekeeping post after that. You fear bees. You steady your hand. Midday arrives, and with it, a fleeting moment of sun. A single golden beam slips through the cracked window and lands on your manuscript like divine approval. You pause. You feel something. Maybe it's grace. Maybe it's vitamin D. Either way, it's brief. A cloud passes. Back to darkness. In the margin, you draw a tiny face. Just 2 dots and a mouth. Nothing dramatic. But it's a rebellion. A rebellion that will live forever. Or be scraped off tomorrow by Brother Censorinus, who thinks joy is a gateway drug to hell. Someone drops a scroll across the room. The sound is deafening in the quiet. You all look up, not at the monk, but at the scroll. Is it damaged? Has the word survived? Yes. You return to work. The monk is already forgotten. Time does not pass in here. It loops. It echoes. It sighs. You finish the page. Carefully. Lovingly. You blow on the ink to dry it. Not too hard. You've learned your lesson. 1 gust too many and it's Smudge City. Population. You. Dinner comes. It's a broth again. Or perhaps the memory of one. You eat in silence, chew in rhythm, pretend it fills you. It doesn't. But you're not here to be full. You're here to be faithful. And slightly hunched. That night, you light your candle. You read over your work, yes, by candlelight, because what better way to go blind than in service of truth? You notice a mistake, a single wrong letter. It changes everything. You stare at it for a long time. You consider correcting it. But then again, maybe that one small error is your soul finally leaving its fingerprint. Maybe someone will find it one day and wonder if it was intentional. Maybe they'll call it genius. You leave it. You close the book. And you sleep, as always, with ink in your veins and scripture in your teeth. Because tomorrow, the word must go on. And no one else is volunteering. You don't carry a sword. You carry a quill. A feather sharpened to a deadly point, dipped in ink darker than your thoughts and wielded with the precision of someone whose entire value is measured in how invisible they can be. You don't conquer cities. You conquer silence. 1 letter at a time. And make no mistake, your quill is sharper than any knight's blade. It just kills slower. You weren't trained to fight. You were trained to copy, to preserve. To bleed your eyesight dry in the service of someone else's genius. And while nobles make history and bishops rewrite it, you're the one who keeps it from vanishing. Quietly, painstakingly, without applause. Because applause is for people who speak. And you, dear scribe, took a vow to shut up and write. Your enemies? Time, mold, fire, rats. Also Brother Anselm, who keeps stealing your ink and pretending it evaporated mysteriously in the night. You've considered retaliation. You've imagined slipping a marginal note into his manuscript. Hic is stultissimus, this one's an idiot. But you won't. Because you're too tired, too loyal, and because medieval passive-aggressiveness is best expressed through prolonged eye contact during Vespers. Today, you're copying Aristotle. Again, a philosopher who never asked to be copied in the dark by men who haven't seen a woman since the First Crusade. Still, you transcribe him lovingly. Not because you agree, not because you understand everything, but because the words matter. They must. Otherwise, what's the point of all this hand-cramping fidelity? You pause, stare at the candle. The flame dances like it's mocking you, alive, wild, temporary. You are none of those things. You are routine made flesh. You are discipline with a bad back. But in this moment, with the candle whispering and the parchment glowing gold around the edges, something flickers. Could it be pride? No. That's a sin. Must be something else. Maybe purpose. Or madness. At this point, you wouldn't know the difference. You remember the time you wrote an entire psalter only to have it locked in a chest and buried under a stack of dead saints. No one read it. No one ever will. But it's there, like a ghost in the attic of civilization. That's your legacy. Sacred invisibility. If the world were a stage, you'd be the one sweeping it after the actors bowed. You think about illumination, not the divine kind. The kind with gold leaf and bright blue lapis lazuli crushed into powder and applied to Jesus's halo with a brush made from squirrel fur. Yes, squirrel. You remember collecting the fur yourself. The squirrel did not go quietly. That's commitment. That's theology in action. That's what separates the monks from the tourists. Once, a traveling scholar visited the abbey. He said, "You monks are the backbone of knowledge." You almost cried. Then he took your manuscript, didn't credit your work, and left. That, you realized, is the academic cycle. You produce. They publish. You die. They get tenure. Still, you keep going. Because the alternative is worse. A world without memory. Without books. Without the slow, deliberate scratching of a quill across parchment in the stillness of dawn. Without minds being passed hand to hand, like torches in the dark. You are not the light. You are the match. And you are burning quietly. Outside, the wind howls. The walls creak. A raven screeches somewhere, because every monastery must include at least one foreboding bird, by ecclesiastical ordinance. You don't look up. You're too deep in the work. The ink flows. The letters curve. You reach the end of the sentence. You read it back. It's perfect. You smile. Then blot it by accident with your sleeve. You don't scream. You just inhale. Slowly. Like a man who has forgotten what emotions feel like but remembers that rage is definitely one of them. You start again. Because that's what you do. Your quill may not kill kings, but it makes them immortal. And that's a kind of power too. Even if no one bothers to write your name. Our hands have forgotten warmth. Not from fire, from touch. You haven't been touched in years, except by ink, prayer, and the slow crawl of time. Your breath clouds in the air, mixing with the musty scent of old parchment and boiled cabbage, the twin perfumes of monastic life. You squint at the page. The ink bottle has frozen slightly. Again, you try to stir it with the tip of your quill, like a sad alchemist trying to resurrect enthusiasm. It doesn't work. Nothing does. But you keep going, because if you stop, someone will notice. And the only thing worse than being ignored here is being noticed. You shift on your stool, which is roughly the comfort level of a brick with an attitude problem. Your legs have gone numb. Again, you imagine what it would feel like to run. Just sprint. Out of the abbey, into the forest, barefoot, wild, free. Then you remember you've eaten nothing but lentils and humility for 6 years and would probably faint after 20 steps. You sigh, and return to the Book of Hours. The irony is not lost on you. You are writing about divine light with frozen fingers, about holy fire while shaking like a leaf left behind on the last tree of November. God is love, but apparently not central heating. You stare at your hands. They've become claws, bent, ink-stained, trembling. You used to dream of holding relics, of opening ancient doors to forbidden wisdom. Now you just hope to hold your spoon at dinner without dropping it into your lap. Small goals, spiritual victories. And yet, there's warmth. Not physical. God no, that would require insulation. But something else. A kind of stubborn heat that lives in the spine. A defiant flame that flickers even as everything around it freezes. You've copied the same prayer 10,000 times, but each one still lands in your hand like a whisper from someone who knows you're still here. Still working. Still trying. You think of your younger self. The boy who entered these walls with eyes wide and a heart full of metaphors. He's still in there somewhere, under the layers of obedience and frostbite. He might even be proud, or at least impressed you haven't died yet. Eventually, your hands warm enough to move. You return to the page. The letters flow again, slowly, like blood through a frozen vein. But they come, and that's enough. You may be cold, but your words are not. They carry a fire your body forgot how to feel. And that's why you stay. That's why you write. Not because it's easy, not because it's warm, but because someone has to keep the light alive, even when the hands holding it are shaking. Once, as a boy, you traced your name into the mud outside your home. You didn't know it yet, but it was the last time you'd ever write something without asking permission. That mud is gone now, but the habit stayed. You weren't supposed to think. You were supposed to transcribe, to replicate, to become the human version of carbon paper with a haircut and a soul. Creativity? That was for sinners and scholars with too much free time. You, on the other hand, had the divine duty of obedience, one looped E at a time. But here's the thing. When you spend 12 hours a day copying the thoughts of dead men, your own thoughts start whispering back. Quietly, carefully, in the margins. The first time it happened, you didn't mean to. A fly landed on the page. You swatted it, left a smear. You could have scraped it, could have started over. But instead you drew a halo around it. Just a joke, just a moment. Brother Gregory didn't notice. God might have. You felt alive for 7 full seconds. And so it began. The rebellion. Not in fire. Not in blood, but in ink. A tiny man riding a snail in the bottom corner of a sermon on chastity. A grumpy monk drawn upside down beneath a paragraph about humility. A sentence translated a little too loosely because the original Latin was boring and you were feeling spicy. You knew the rules. You broke them in 8-point script. You're not alone. Every monk in this room has done it. Some better than others. Brother Thomas once inserted a cat chasing a mouse into the Gospel of Luke. Said it was symbolic. We all know it was revenge on the refectory cat for stealing his bread. These aren't just doodles. They are therapy, sanity, proof that you still exist beneath the robe and the ink stains. That there's still a heartbeat under the hood. That you, beneath all the silence, still remember how to laugh. Even if it's the kind of laughter that could technically get you excommunicated. The abbot, of course, pretends not to see any of it. He walks through the scriptorium like a man convinced his monks are living saints, not sleep-deprived introverts with too many opinions about grammar. Occasionally, he pauses, lifts a page, squints. You hold your breath. He lowers it, walks on. You exhale. The margin doodle lives another day. Sometimes you sneak in commentary. Little notes, written so small only someone truly obsessed will ever find them. This sentence makes no sense. probably invented this number. Author clearly never met a woman. You wonder if future historians will read your jabs and say, "Ah yes, sarcasmus monasticus, a forgotten literary tradition." The irony, of course, is that while you're writing about piety, submission, eternal obedience, your heart is scribbling footnotes in protest. It's beautiful, really. Sacred anarchy. The kind that only flourishes in places where joy has to disguise itself as punctuation. And still, you keep your face blank, your posture rigid, your letters immaculate. No one must know. Not because it's shameful, but because it's yours. In a life where everything you do belongs to the monastery, to God, to history, the margin is yours alone. A space just wide enough to say, "I see the world." A space just narrow enough to whisper, "And I'm still in it." That's where you live now. Between the lines. Behind the pages. In jokes too old for laughter. In drawings too quiet to be noticed. In the tiniest acts of resistance that make your hands shake less and your soul breathe more. Not every rebellion wears armor. Some rebellions wear robes. And draw snails. There's a room in the monastery that no one talks about directly. They'll call it the chamber, or the quiet vault, or Brother Ambrose's allergy trigger. But never what it really is, a library. A forbidden garden of leather-bound temptation. Because while monks pretend to care only about heaven, deep down, they're just hoarders with a better PR team. The first time you entered it, you thought you'd stumbled into paradise. Not golden, not warm, but thick. With knowledge. With air so stale it crackled. The smell? A mix of ink, mildew, dead spiders, and eternity. It was glorious. You walked between shelves like a man discovering fire, except less useful, more likely to trigger asthma. Scrolls stacked like sleeping saints. Codices chained to desks like prisoners who knew too much. One of them, you were told, contained the only surviving copy of a lost Roman treatise on dental hygiene. You don't even care. It might be fake, but the idea that it could be real? That's the drug. Everything in here is guarded, locked, labeled, catalogued with such obsessive detail that you're pretty sure Brother Bartholomew once assigned a personality type to each book. He says the Psalter is a melancholic introvert with trust issues. No one argues. You weren't allowed to touch anything at first. You had to earn your way in. Months of proving you wouldn't sneeze near vellum. That your fingers were dry. That you respected the sacred order of parchment over people. Eventually, they let you help. Just shelving, at first. Then indexing. Now, you're allowed to handle them. Carefully. Reverently. Like you're holding a baby with a PhD. You cradle the spines like relics. You open the pages like prayers. And you learn things. Strange things. Not just theology and Latin grammar, but gossip disguised as marginalia. Scandalous footnotes. Diagrams that look suspiciously like beer recipes. Maps to cities no longer on maps. Books written by monks who clearly didn't sleep much and maybe, just maybe, invented a few saints for dramatic effect. One manuscript claims a bishop once turned a goat into a nun. Another has a note that simply reads, "Do not trust Brother Ulrich with cheese." You're not sure if it's a joke or a warning, but you've kept your brie far away from Ulrich ever since. There's a book hidden behind a fake panel. You found it by accident. It was labeled "Do not open, ever," which is, of course, monk for open immediately. You did. It's just a list of sins. Thousands of them. Some you didn't even know were possible. Page 134, lustful glancing at fish. You closed it. Slowly. Respectfully. The point is, this place matters. More than the chapel. More than the dining hall. Maybe even more than the abbot's good opinion. Because in here, under dust and chain and flickering candlelight, is everything the world once knew. Everything it tried to forget. Everything it might still need. You realize, eventually, that the library is not just a room. It's a time capsule, a confession booth, a graveyard, a seed vault. It's a place where dead men whisper and forgotten truths wait patiently for someone to care again. And maybe you're not the hero of history. Maybe you're not even a footnote. But when you dust off a manuscript, when you bind a broken spine, when you write ex libris in the corner of a page no one has touched in 200 years, you're not just preserving the past. You're daring the future to remember it. In a world on fire, you're the one guarding the matches and the instructions. You thought the hardest part would be the silence, or the cold, or maybe the 4 a.m. prayers that sound less like devotion and more like a Gregorian hostage situation. But no, it's the Latin. The Latin is what breaks you. Not classical Latin. Oh no, that would be too dignified. You're stuck with ecclesiastical Latin. Medieval Latin. Latin, but make it chaotic. Some sentences are so mangled you're not sure if you're translating theology or the last words of a man slowly drowning in vowels. You read one passage 5 times and still have no idea if it's about a feast day or a murder. Both seem equally plausible. Then there's the Old French. The weird, early, nasal kind that sounds like someone trying to cough politely while choking on a syllable. And the Greek, written in a hand so cramped it looks like the writer was actively being judged by God while scribbling. You spend an entire afternoon trying to figure out if a certain word means blessing, plague, or goat. All 3 make sense in context. You go with goat. Why not? Brother Lucian once translated eternal light as perpetual candle situation. No one corrected him. We all needed the laugh. The truth is, language here isn't a tool, it's a trap. A sacred riddle wrapped in a metaphor, dipped in ink, then dropped in a snowbank for 3 centuries. Every translation is a gamble. Every sentence a cryptic crossword designed by someone who never intended to be understood. Sometimes you come across entire paragraphs that feel like linguistic hallucinations. Words so obscure they appear only once in all of recorded history. In those moments, you invent. You guess. You channel the Holy Spirit and pray that divine context will cover your tracks. There's no glory in it. No applause. Just the occasional grunt of approval from Brother Matthias, which is as close to a standing ovation as you'll ever get. You start to develop a twitch in your left eye. You tell yourself it's just strain. It's not. It's your soul trying to escape through the nearest available muscle. Once, while translating a particularly dense passage from Boethius, you paused and whispered, "No one's going to read this." Then you laughed. Then you cried. Then you spilled ink on the table and called it divine intervention. But you keep going, because maybe someone will read it. Someday. Maybe a student. Maybe a king. Maybe a bored tourist in a museum gift shop, skimming a plaque you helped preserve. You reach for the dictionary. Again. You open to a page filled with smudges, marginal notes, and a mysterious stain you don't ask about. The word you need isn't there. It never is. So you improvise. Again. Because here in the monastery, meaning is a mosaic made of guesses, ghosts, and grammatically questionable faith. And if the word truly became flesh, then you're the one stuck trying to conjugate it into something coherent. Before you lose your mind, or your eyesight, or both. You may not speak the languages of angels, but you've definitely argued with some in the footnotes. Eventually, the light begins to fail. Not the candlelight, that died hours ago. Not the sunlight, you haven't seen that in weeks. Your eyes, they blur, they flicker, they start replacing letters with little smudged hallucinations. You blink. Once. Twice. The words come back. Mostly. You keep writing anyway. You used to worry about getting things wrong. Now you just hope your quill doesn't snap mid-sentence and stab you in the eye. That actually happened to Brother Eligius. He had to finish copying Deuteronomy with one hand and a patch over the other eye like a pirate of salvation. They called him Saint Cyclops behind his back. Monks are cruel in quiet ways. Your body has started negotiating with gravity. Your spine leans, like a tree that no longer trusts the wind. Your knees creak. Your hands tremble. Your neck makes a sound now. A new one. You've named it the crack of doom. Brother Aurelian has a similar one. You harmonize sometimes. Not on purpose. You no longer dream. Or if you do, the dreams are of margins and smudges and pages that never end. You wake up whispering line breaks. You fall asleep mid-psalm. You once copied a letter about love, not divine, but human. A letter between two people who never met again. You memorized it, not for theology, but because, for a moment, it reminded you that people out there still waited for someone. Sometimes you wonder if you've been forgotten, if the world outside has moved on, if cities have risen, kings have fallen, if someone out there has invented a better stool. But here, nothing changes, except you. You grow older. You grow slower. You grow quieter. Like a book being read too many times. The spine weakens. The corners fray. The meaning stays, but the container begins to fail. The abbot stops assigning you long texts. He says it's to give the younger scribes a chance. You know what it means. You're being shelved. You try to feel grateful. More time for prayer. For contemplation. But mostly it's just more time to feel the cold. To think. To count the days by the number of meals you forgot to taste. And yet, you still write. Slowly. Painfully. Not for the monastery. Not even for God. For the page. For the way it still receives you. Without judgment. Without pity. For the way a single stroke of ink can still feel like creation. Like defiance. Like proof that you're still here. One night, you stay late in the scriptorium. Everyone else has gone to Compline. You sit in the dim flicker of a dying flame, finishing a sentence no one assigned you. It's not from scripture. It's not from Aristotle. It's yours. Just a line. A thought. A whisper in ink. You don't sign your name. You know better. But you smile. Because in this monastery, in this life of repetition and reverence and quiet erosion, you left something behind. A word that wasn't copied. A thought that wasn't borrowed. A flicker of light. Written just before everything went dark. You die quietly. No fanfare. No choir. No Latin sung in your honor. Just a wheeze, a flicker, a final cramp in the wrist, and then silence. Brother Anselm finds you the next morning, hunched over a page half finished, the ink still wet enough to weep. They bury you behind the chapel. No headstone, just a wooden marker that will rot before anyone bothers to read it. But the manuscript? It lives. It's stored. It's shelved. It's forgotten. For now. Centuries pass. The monastery crumbles. The vines return. The roof collapses. The abbot's name is erased from memory by weather and war and general disinterest. But your book, your quiet, meticulous, ink-stained, vertebrae-destroying masterpiece, somehow survives. A scholar finds it. In a dusty box. In a library that forgot why it even had that box. She opens it. Gasps. "This is beautiful," she says. And you, long dead, long buried, long ignored, are suddenly breathing again through her mouth. Your letters, those fragile loops of discipline and pain, are now printed in glossy catalogues. Academic journals. Exhibitions. Blog posts. They frame your marginal doodle of the snail. Call it proto-surrealist commentary on ecclesiastical hierarchy. You call it boredom, but whatever works. You don't get credit, of course. You are anonymous. Which, in monk terms, is code for did all the work. Still, you live. In paper, in pigment, in whispers across glass museum cases. A tourist squints, reads a translated line, doesn't understand it, but feels something anyway. A flicker, a hum. You exist in that moment. A quill stroke carried through time. Unnoticed, undeniable. Your name is lost, but your work is not. And maybe that's enough. Because in a world that burns, deletes, and forgets, you left behind something that stayed. Something copied. Something stubborn. Something sacred. You, who were silent, now speak. You, who were erased, now echo. You, whose ink held the world together for centuries. Sleep now, anonymous monk. The world never knew your name, but it read you. And maybe that was enough. But not for everyone. Because long before your quill ever touched parchment, long before Latin dreamed of verbs or scripture learned how to whisper, there was another fire. Brighter, louder, hungrier. It didn't scribble in margins. It swallowed them whole. It was Alexandria. This story isn't just about fire. It's about forgetting on purpose. About how humanity once held the stars in its hand, and then dropped them like a bad idea. So if you've ever felt like you were born too late to matter, too modern to touch magic, too digital to dream big, I have news. You're not too late. You're just living in the aftermath of erasure. So, before we go any further, take a breath, dim the lights, maybe light a candle, or at least stare at your screen until it glows like regret. Turn on that fan. That soft hum in the background makes it feel like the ghosts are still whispering. And if you like stories that are equal parts insomnia, sarcasm, and historic existential crisis, consider subscribing. Only if you want to, of course. There's no ancient vow here. Just curiosity. Now, let's go back. To a coastline that glittered. To a city made of ambition. To a place where the entire world, its languages, its poems, its failures, was gathered together in one building, and dared not to forget. A place where scrolls outnumbered citizens. Where memory had an address. Where knowledge didn't just live. It multiplied, and then one day, it didn't. Because someone, or maybe everyone, decided that knowing too much was dangerous. Welcome to Alexandria, the city that knew everything, until it didn't. It didn't begin with flames. It began with marble, with columns carved like pride and limestone stacked like ambition. Alexandria wasn't built for the gods. It was built for men who thought they could outright them. Ptolemy I had a vision. Not a humble one. The kind of vision that orders the sea to make room. That tells the desert to hush. That whispers, we will store everything here. Forever. And the desert listened. For a while. You see, Alexandria wasn't just a city. It was a flex. A calculated, sunlit insult to ignorance. It stared the ancient world in the face and said, we will remember what you forget. And worse, we will remember it better. The library was its heart. Not a building. A machine. A nervous system made of scrolls and silence. Scholars weren't invited. They were absorbed. Ships that docked in Alexandria had their texts confiscated. Politely, of course, with all the diplomatic grace of a cultural mugging. The originals were copied, then archived. And the ships? Returned with a fresh duplicate and a subtle feeling of intellectual robbery. This was not theft. This was preservation. At least, that's what they told themselves. Because in Alexandria, knowledge wasn't free. It was collected, like rare coins, or sins. Papyrus flowed through the city like blood. Ink ran like gossip. Scribes worked in shifts so long they probably forgot their own names. Not that it mattered, because no one came to Alexandria to be remembered. They came so their ideas would be. And the ideas came. Astronomy, mathematics, engineering, poetry that made gods blush, medical manuals that knew more than modern hospitals, maps that whispered of lands the Romans hadn't even lied about yet. They studied anatomy through dissection, an act so scandalous, it practically made philosophers faint. But Alexandria wasn't concerned with blushing. It wanted truth. And if truth came wrapped in intestines, so be it. The city believed in accumulation. Every fragment mattered. If a peasant in Persia had a theory about rainfall, someone in Alexandria probably wrote it down, catalogued it, and cross-referenced it with the dreams of an Egyptian priest. This wasn't curiosity. This was obsession. But obsession has a smell. A weight, a heat that makes rulers sweat and priests nervous. Because when a place gathers every idea, eventually, it gathers the wrong ones, too. Ideas that question gods. Ideas that predict eclipses. Ideas that whisper, "You are not chosen, just early." Still, the dream bloomed. A garden of knowledge with no fences. Only doors made of questions. For a few shining generations, the world tilted slightly toward memory. Not power, not conquest, but memory. And that made it dangerous. Because nothing threatens a kingdom like facts. Nothing unsettles a faith like footnotes. Nothing spooks a warlord more than someone who can read. So Alexandria stood. White stone under blue sky, its scrolls piled higher than its defenses. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of its halls, a shadow waited, with a torch, because every great dream eventually meets someone who prefers smoke. There's something terrifying about a book that doesn't need you, a book that doesn't flatter your worldview, that doesn't beg to be understood. It just sits there, patient, filled with equations you can't solve and gods you've never heard of, filled with names more ancient than your ancestors' regrets. Alexandria collected those books. Not the kind you find in gift shops. Not bound journals with motivational quotes and scented bookmarks. No, these were scrolls of unfiltered thought. Ideas still raw from their birth. Theories that hadn't been diluted by centuries of approval. Knowledge with teeth. Some of the scrolls described machines that shouldn't exist. Others mapped the stars with more accuracy than some modern apps. There were treatises on surgery that made Roman physicians look like butchers. There were hymns to forgotten gods that sang of peace, not punishment. There were scrolls that said the earth moved, that the heart pumped blood, that the soul might be metaphor, that women could think, that time was cyclical, that truth didn't wear a crown. And that was the problem, because books that think too much tend to remind people how little they know. And people, especially important ones, don't like being reminded. They prefer their world simple, flat, neatly divided into ruler and ruled, with a little divine justification sprinkled on top like holy seasoning. But Alexandria's library didn't care about simplicity. It cared about complexity. Messy, uncomfortable, Inconvenient complexity. A scroll doesn't kneel. It doesn't tremble. It doesn't apologize for existing. And in a world obsessed with control, that kind of paper is flammable. Of course, not all of it was dangerous. Some scrolls were just strange. Recipes that involved moonlight and apricot wine. Philosophies that debated whether shadows had souls. Records of dreams people had after eating too much lentil stew. But even the strange ones mattered. Because somewhere in the clutter, truth was hiding. Truth about the body. About the mind. About what it meant to be human. Before empires turned that into a marketing category, Alexandria believed that everything was worth keeping. Until proven otherwise. We argue over what burned: scrolls, science, dreams. But what we lost was possibility. And now all we have is smoke. And the echo of something that once understood us. Better than we understand ourselves. The irony? It wasn't the knowledge that failed. It was the people. The books didn't beg to be destroyed. They didn't rise up and challenge the throne. They just existed, quietly, inconveniently, with their little facts and their dangerous questions. And men, being men, couldn't handle that. So they struck the match. And centuries of memory, of wonder, of possibility, turned to ash in a single act of ignorance. Books don't bleed. But that night, the world did. Because when Alexandria burned, we didn't just lose scrolls. We lost mirrors. Mirrors that might have shown us who we were. And who we might have become. Instead, we got myths. And ruins. And 1,000-watt IFS whispering through time. And still, somewhere, deep in the soul of our species, we remember, not the words, but the loss. And that, maybe, is the saddest knowledge of all. She wasn't supposed to be remembered. Women weren't built for that, according to the times. They were meant to bear children, not arguments. To warm homes, not lecture halls. To recite prayers, not rewrite philosophy. But Hypatia didn't get the memo. Or maybe she got it. Read it. And laughed. She taught in the open. In public. To men who knew they weren't smarter than her. But hoped proximity might make them clever by osmosis. She spoke of planets and the nature of reality. She asked questions that peeled faith like fruit. She solved equations that hadn't even been invented yet. And she did it all, while being a woman, in a world that barely tolerated women who breathed too loudly. Hypatia didn't whisper. She lectured. In Alexandria. In temples. In streets. With chalk, papyrus, and terrifying clarity. And the city, for a while, listened. Because brilliance has a way of forcing even the proudest necks to bow. And Hypatia was brilliance wrapped in skin, draped in robes, armed with reason sharper than any sword. But Alexandria was changing. The scrolls still stood, but the firewood was being stacked. Ideas that once danced were now judged. Faith was growing teeth. And Hypatia, well, she was inconvenient. She didn't belong to the Christians, or the pagans, or the politicians. She belonged to logic, and logic doesn't pick sides. It just reveals them, which made her dangerous. Because Alexandria, once proud of its contradictions, was becoming allergic to nuance. The crowds no longer gathered to listen. They gathered to accuse, to point, to punish. It didn't happen all at once. First came the whispers, that she dabbled in dark arts, that her calculations were spells, that her wisdom was arrogance. that her refusal to kneel was heresy. Then came the mob. Not a metaphorical one, a real one, with fists, stones, and the kind of righteousness that only comes when you've stopped thinking altogether. They found her in the streets, stripped her, beat her, dragged her through Alexandria like an idea that refused to die quietly. They didn't just kill her, they disassembled her, tore her body apart in pieces, like they were trying to undo the centuries of progress she represented. And in that moment, on that blood-soaked street, surrounded by a crowd more afraid of knowledge than of violence, Alexandria's soul cracked. Because Hypatia was more than a scholar. She was the last question the city asked, before it forgot how to question. And when she died, the fire came quicker. Her death was not the cause of the library's fall. It was the omen, the bell, the whispered warning that memory was no longer welcome. That thought would now be judged by torchlight, and science would be rewritten by those with louder voices and smaller minds. There are no surviving works of Hypatia, no scrolls, no theorems, just echoes, mentions in the margins of other men's histories. She became a ghost, a footnote, an afterthought in a story she once authored. But that's how Alexandria ends, not in a single blaze, but in a slow erosion of courage. One voice silenced at a time. One woman murdered. One book lost. One truth twisted. And that's how the greatest library in human history began to forget itself. With the death of a woman who remembered too much. Fire doesn't care what it eats. It doesn't check credentials, or read Latin, or ask whether the scroll it's devouring once held the cure for something. It just burns. Blindly. Eagerly. Like a dog let off its leash, chasing the scent of everything we ever feared to know. And Alexandria fed it well. Because by the time the fires came, and they came more than once, the city was already fragile. Not physically, but ideologically. Memory had become inconvenient. Books were no longer treasures. They were accusations. Accusations against ignorance, against fear, against power structures that preferred their subjects dumb, barefoot, and awed by thunder. History blames Caesar, monks, or caliphs. Truth blames no one. Fire doesn't care what it eats. And maybe they're all true. Or none of them, because the real fire wasn't made of flame. It was willful neglect. It was fear masquerading as righteousness. It was centuries of people deciding they didn't want to know. The scrolls didn't scream. They simply curled into themselves, their ink vanishing into air, their knowledge collapsing into embers like lungs giving out. Some say 400,000 scrolls were lost. Others say it was more. Some say fewer. All of them miss the point. It wasn't the number. It was the weight. What burned wasn't paper. It was the possibility of knowing. You want an image? Picture a man tossing a scroll into a fire. A scroll that once held the anatomical notes of a Greek surgeon, who dissected bodies in secret, hoping to map the soul through sinew. Now imagine that same man, warming his hands over the ashes of someone else's brilliance. That's Alexandria, a city where priests turned parchment into kindling, where generals used books as barricades, where scribes wept, not for safety, but for every word that would never be copied again. They didn't call it censorship. They called it purification. They called it divine justice. They called it progress. Because it's easier to rename a fire than to admit you're the one who lit it. Even the sea couldn't save them. Ships that once brought knowledge from distant shores now carried soldiers, dogma, and smoke. And the people, those left behind, told stories, made excuses, blamed others, because no one wants to admit that memory burns best when the match is lit from inside the house. That's what Alexandria teaches us. Not that we once lost knowledge, but that we chose to lose it. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. Not the fire, but the silence that came after. Not empty, not hollow, ash-heavy silence. The kind that sticks in your throat when you try to remember what you were never allowed to know. We like to think we know what was lost, as if a spreadsheet could capture obliteration, as if listing titles would restore the weight of ideas reduced to shadows. But Alexandria didn't just lose books. It lost timelines, versions, alternatives, whole realities that could have unfolded, but didn't. There may have been a scroll describing a method to navigate the stars using a spoon and a shadow. Another, perhaps, had a theory about disease that would have saved 2 million lives. If only someone had read it before the fire did. There could have been music written in a language we no longer recognize. Poetry that didn't rhyme, but still managed to bruise. Maps that charted continents we now pretend were never visited. Manuals for machines that shouldn't have existed for another 1,000 years. Gone. Not stolen. Not buried. Burned. And not just the content, but the context. Because a book isn't just information. It's a conversation across centuries. A voice preserved. A mind encoded. When you burn it, you're not destroying paper. You're severing the handshake between past and future. We didn't just lose scrolls. We lost the questions they hadn't asked yet. Someone, somewhere, had just begun outlining a theory of light. Another had just recorded the migration patterns of birds over the Red Sea. Someone had started a new translation of a Babylonian epic. One that might have redefined mythology as we know it. All gone. Because knowledge doesn't beg. It waits. And if ignored long enough, it goes silent. Historians call it a tragedy. Poets call it a wound. But let's be honest. It was a massacre. And not just of paper, but of potential. What if the Renaissance had come 500 years earlier? What if calculus wasn't invented, but reinvented? What if the cure for diseases we still fight was sitting in a scroll someone used to light a torch? We'll never know. And maybe that's the cruelest part. Not the loss, but the unknowing. Because ignorance has many forms. But this was inherited ignorance. A legacy of forgetting. Passed down like a family curse. And even now, centuries later, you can feel it. That aching gap in history. That sense that something is missing. Not a fact, but a thread. A thread that might have led somewhere beautiful, or terrible, or transformative. But it's gone. Charred. Drifting in the wind over a coastline that once held the memory of the world. And we're just the children of the ashes. We build libraries of our own. Yes, but deep down, we know, we're not starting from scratch. We're starting from what survived. And survival, while noble, is not the same as wholeness. So next time someone tells you history is a straight line, remind them, it wasn't. It caught fire. And we're walking its crooked, scorched remains. When you picture a barbarian, what do you see? A man in furs, covered in dirt and testosterone, grunting, screaming, holding a club, maybe, dragging culture by the hair? That's the image we were sold. Wild, unrefined, a threat from the outside. But the truth is more unsettling. Because the real barbarians didn't come from the forests. They came from universities, from temples, from palaces, wearing clean linen and smug certainty, speaking Latin, holding scrolls in one hand and torches in the other. They didn't smash statues. They rebranded them. They didn't burn libraries out of rage. They burned them out of policy. The destruction of Alexandria wasn't a crime of impulse. It was a strategy, a slow, methodical suffocation of memory, by men who believed they were saving the world from itself. Because you can't control a people who remember too much. So they rewrote, they erased, they substituted gods, sanitized the margins, translated dissent into silence. And they did it politely, with bureaucracy, with titles, with carefully worded declarations of moral authority. Some of them wore armor, but most wore robes, or crosses, or wreaths of laurel, to decorate heads that couldn't tolerate contradiction. Barbarism doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it preaches. Sometimes it legislates. Sometimes it kneels before an altar and whispers, "Let us purify the past." Let's be clear. It wasn't ignorance that destroyed Alexandria. It was intelligence in the service of fear. The kind of intelligence that knows exactly which books to burn and which to plagiarize. That understands the value of knowledge and destroys it on purpose. Because a savage burns what he doesn't understand. But a civilized man? He burns what threatens his comfort. He calls it heresy, or progress, or reform. And everyone applauds. Because no one wants to be the one, still clinging to uncomfortable truths. When the tide of lies comes dressed in white marble and good intentions. They wore togas. They wore vestments. They spoke of heaven while emptying the earth of wisdom. They built cathedrals from the stones of temples. They'd condemned as evil. They founded schools upon the bones of burned teachers. They redefined virtue as obedience, and the world believed them. Because we're conditioned to think that order means good, that clean means kind, that educated means enlightened. But Alexandria teaches otherwise. It teaches that some of the darkest chapters in history were written in perfect grammar. That ignorance doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it wears sandals. Sometimes it quotes scripture. Sometimes it thanks God before lighting the match. And somewhere in the smoldering quiet, the scrolls don't scream. They just fall apart. Quietly, like civilization shedding the parts it no longer has the courage to carry. History doesn't like a vacuum. When something disappears, we don't mourn it. We replace it. We sweep up the ashes, build an altar where the fireplace used to be, and pretend there was never a library there in the first place. That's what happened after Alexandria. The dust settled, and someone decided to call it doctrine, because it's easier to fill the silence with commandments than with questions. Easier to canonize ignorance than to admit we killed the cure. So we told ourselves stories. We rewrote the world. We filled the shelves not with knowledge, but with certainty. Certainty sells. It governs. It sanctifies. And somewhere along the way, people forgot that once upon a time, we didn't know everything, and we were okay with that. They took the ruins of wisdom and built walls with them. Not schools, not archives, walls. To keep the questions out, to keep the curiosity in check, to guard against the return of the uncomfortable. And from those walls, they preached. They said, "This is how the universe works. This is what the stars are for. This is what women are allowed to think. This is how far your imagination may go, no further." No one remembered what used to be written, so no one could argue. And that's how forgetting becomes holy. Because when there's no memory left to contradict you, even the most fragile lie calcifies into truth. The dust of Alexandria became dogma, not because it deserved to, but because it was convenient. Somewhere, someone asked, "Did we lose anything important?" And someone else, wearing a robe and the weight of stolen authority, said, "No, just pagan nonsense." And the rest nodded, because it's easier to nod than to mourn something you never knew you needed. We traded curiosity for compliance, imagination for instruction, knowledge for nostalgia, the kind that smooths over the scars and paints history as progress instead of casualty. Entire generations grew up thinking the world had always been small, always ruled by the same books, always shaped by the same hands. They didn't question it, because the questions had been burned, and the answers were easier to memorize when there were fewer of them. The few who dared to remember, the scribes, the poets, the mad ones, were dismissed as eccentrics, told to color inside lines that had been drawn with the soot of incinerated scrolls. You don't need chains when you erase the maps, and you don't need fire when forgetfulness becomes policy. And so, the memory of the greatest library on earth was filed away, under legend, under myth, under maybe it wasn't that important. Because dust doesn't complain, it just settles. And once it settles long enough, we build temples on top of it, and we call that history. Look around, not just at your screen, but at your world, at your calendar, at your medicine cabinet, at the way you name planets, categorize species, tell time, measure silence. Now ask yourself, how much of this is based on what we know, and how much is based on what we never recovered? You are here, in this version of history, not because it was the only path, but because all the other paths caught fire. Every algorithm you scroll through, every law you follow, every belief you inherit, is built atop an architecture of absence, a scaffolding of what never made it out of Alexandria. You think you live in the information age, but this is just the afterparty of a funeral no one attended. The scrolls are gone, and with them, alternative sciences, forgotten philosophies, languages no longer spoken, arguments never heard, poems that might have saved someone from despair centuries ago. Maybe the cure for something was destroyed before it had a name. Maybe the moral framework you think is universal was just the last one standing. Maybe what we call modern civilization is a survivor of a mass extinction event of ideas. And extinction, in this case, wasn't natural. It was manual, intentional, political, holy, and yet you exist. Which means someone rebuilt, someone remembered, someone whispered the name Alexandria into the ear of a student who wrote it down in the margins of a Bible and kept the whisper alive. And so now you know that the world could have been different, and maybe still can be, but only if you stop confusing volume with depth. We have more data now than Alexandria ever dreamed of. More books, more servers, more code. But what are we building with it? Echo chambers? Ad-driven scrolls that reward reaction over reflection? Noise masquerading as knowledge? The truth is, we have more access than ever, and less memory, because memory isn't just about what you store. It's about what you protect, what you refuse to simplify, what you carry even when it's inconvenient. And most of us were never taught how to carry, only how to consume. You are not here by accident. You are here because history was pruned, not like a gardener shapes a rose, more like a butcher trims fat, and sometimes a little meat with it. And now, every discovery you make is colored by what's no longer discoverable. Every belief you defend rests atop a foundation, poured by people who didn't get to read what came before them. You are not the culmination of knowledge. You are the result of forgetting. But that doesn't have to be a tragedy. It can be a beginning, because knowing that something was lost is the first step to making sure it doesn't happen again. Even if you can't recover the scrolls, you can recover the instinct to question, to doubt, to wonder, to hold space for what might still be missing. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do, in a world built on erasure, is remember that something was erased. And maybe, just maybe, write something of your own, before someone else decides. It's safer if you didn't. We like to think we're evolved, that we've come a long way, from lighting torches in the dark, and calling it revelation. But the truth is simpler, darker, more fragile. We were fire, once. Not just light, not just warmth. We were the kind of fire that illuminates from the inside. Curiosity set to flame. Questions that didn't wait for permission. Hands that trembled, not from fear, but from wonder. Alexandria was that fire. It crackled in scrolls. It glowed in questions. It roared in the silence between ideas, waiting to be understood. And then, we let it die. Maybe we were afraid. Maybe we were tired. Maybe we just wanted the world to be simpler. So we chose doctrine over doubt, order over chaos, smoke over flame. And now we sit in that smoke, breathing it in, trying to reconstruct a silhouette, from the ash of a silhouette, of a truth we never bothered to copy twice. You live in that shadow, in a world that pretends it knows, but only because it doesn't remember what it forgot. You build your truths on burned foundations. You search for meaning in footnotes written by survivors of a book burning. No one was brave enough to call by its name, but the ember is still there, somewhere, inside the stubborn, sleepless part of you that stays up at night, asking questions no one gave you permission to ask. You are the descendant of thinkers who were silenced, of scrolls that were never opened, of voices that were never heard, but kept whispering anyway. And every time you wonder, you rekindle. Every time you read with reverence, you resurrect. Every time you write something true, without fear, without needing applause, you burn quietly against the tide of forgetting. So no, you are not too late. You are not powerless. You are not lost. You are smoke with memory, and that means you're still warm, still capable of catching fire. In the right wind. The monk with the bleeding quill knew it. Hypatia knew it. The scribes, the dreamers, the forgotten ones, they all knew. That one page is enough. That one sentence, copied in the dark, can survive 1,000 years. If someone dares to read it out loud, So whisper if you must. But write, speak, burn, and let the world see the flame again. Because someone, centuries from now, might find your words in the dust. And breathe. So now, turn off the screen. Let the light fade. The story's over, but the smoke is still here. You can feel it, can't you? Not on your skin, but in the space behind your thoughts. That itch to remember something you were never taught. Maybe tonight, you'll dream of scrolls, of voices too ancient to name, but still loud enough to echo. And maybe, just maybe, you'll wake up tomorrow with a question no one gave you permission to ask. If so, hold on to it. That's where the fire lives now. Good night. Sleep deep. And if you liked wandering through the ruins with me, you know what to do. Subscribe. Whisper it. Burn it into your memory. Or just remember that you were here. That we were here. Reconstructing ghosts. From ash. Until next time, stay curious. And don't forget what they tried to erase.